Okay, good morning, ladies and gents. This is, I believe it's Module 24, and I'm going to start off with just a quick layout of the unit. We've been talking about classical conditioning up to now, and right now we're going to switch from that type of learning, which is associated with Pavlov, and we're going to go to operant conditioning, which is the second uh, type of learning, and that is most commonly linked with B.F. Skinner. A lot of you might think that Freud is the most psychological, or important psychologist with his effect on today. Believe it or not, B.F. Skinner is thought to be the person who has, in the most recent past, had the greatest effect on what we know about psychology today, just by this type of conditioning, which you will recognize immediately once we get into it. If you look at classical conditioning was around an association. You take a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, and you associate a natural response to what was an unconditioned stimulus, and even make it conditioned. And so an association, a form between a natural behavior and an event. Now, when we look at it, there is a respondent behavior. It could be flinching, could be blinking. It's an automatic response to a certain stimulus that otherwise previously didn't do it, like a bell tone making a dog salivate. Operant conditioning, however, involves an operant behavior. What we mean is a behavior that operates on the environment, and it can either produce a reward or a punishment. And so, if a dog is rewarded for doing a particular behavior, and they get a treat, then that would be operant conditioning. And if they are punished in some way, then the idea would be that it would reduce the behavior that we're trying to shape or change. The idea of this came from a lot of different places, but Thorndike was probably the first that kind of stimulated Skinner into thinking more about this. Thorndike developed what he called his law of effect, and he actually created what he called puzzle boxes. And this is a box here, and he would place a cat in the box and then time to see how long it took the cat to get out of the box, and there would be a series of levers and doors and strings, and eventually the cat, through its random action, would make its way out. But what Thorndike noticed was that the amount of time began to reduce for the cat to figure out the puzzle box if it was placed in the same puzzle box, particularly if there was a reward outside, like a piece of food. And that once the cat had learned how to get out of the box, each trial got successively shorter as it was heading towards the reward of the food. This led Skinner to develop what we now call the Skinner box, or operant chamber. And it's very simple. You could place like a lab rat or pigeon or something, and there's a food dispenser, there's a water dispenser, there's a light and a speaker and a lever. And then you can have them associate when they hear a sound, push the lever and getting food, or when the light blinks twice and then the speaker says something, push the lever. And you can shape and train behavior in these boxes. They're quite commonly used today. And so, we can track data and use water and food as a reinforcer. It's fairly straightforward. The idea of changing a creature's behavior using operant conditioning, reward or punishment, is referred to as shaping. And I talked about it in class, shaping my little dog so that when we got her from the kennel, that she wouldn't pee in the house, that she would learn to pee outside, and did so with a handful of treats. And here we see, a rat learning to sniff out mines and a minefield, and a manatee discriminating between a red ball or a yellow ball, and that sort of thing in training potentially for a show. The reinforcer is the item that we give, typically in the way of a reward, and they come in two kinds, and they're either a positive reinforcement, and a positive reinforcement is where we add a desirable stimulus, getting a hug, receiving a paycheck, giving a dog a kibble. You're adding something to the life. A negative reinforcement is when we remove something that is negative. And so that nasty bell that goes off in your car until you put your seatbelt on is a good example of negative reinforcement. Once you do the desired behavior, put your seatbelt on, the the uh, the klaxon, the bell stops, and you can continue on your way. Um, those reinforcers can be primary or secondary. A primary reinforcement is an innate reinforcing stimulus like food or drink. It's right there. You know, obviously that if someone gets to eat or someone has something to drink, that's a primary reinforcer. A conditioned reinforcer is one that typically gets its association with the primary reinforcer. So money would be a conditioned reinforcer. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, but you can convert it into all kinds of things in our society. So that would be a conditioned or a secondary type of reinforcer. Reinforcement can either occur immediate or delayed. One that is immediate is one that occurs instantly after a behavior. So, you know, we give the dog a kibble immediately after it pees or poops outside, or a rat presses the bar and immediately gets it. That's an immediate one. A delayed one would be, you know, for example, you getting paid at work. And if you get paid every week or every 2 weeks, then, you know, you go to work each day knowing that on payday, whenever that is, you're going to get that reinforcer sort of all at once. Reinforcement schedules can either be continual or partial. And so a continuous one is every time the person does the behavior, you get rewarded right away. A partial reinforcement is one where it is the reinforcer is not exactly as strong to acquire, but it's very difficult to break. And so this is one where let's say that you're at a slot machine and you're pulling a slot machine. You're not going to get rewarded every time that you do pull the slot machine lever or push the button. It is a partial reinforcement. You get a win every so often. And so while that takes a little longer to instill in the person to get them shaped to want to do that, once they have it, it can be quite addictive and very difficult to extinguish later on. The schedules of how creatures are reinforced can either be fixed, so you know, if you push the lever 10 times you get a win, or it can be variable. And so that's very similar to the slot machine. You don't know whether you press the button 1 time you're going to get a reward, or it could be 50 times you're going to get a reward. You just don't know. And again, it's unpredictable when the reinforcement is going to come. It's a little harder to acquire this, but it's also greater or more difficult to extinguish once you do have it. The intervals can be fixed, so like I say, after every 10 minutes you get a reward, or it can be variable. You just don't know when it's going to come. Something like a pop quiz, you're not sure when it's going to come up. When it does, it does. Fixed is predictable, variable is not predictable. So if we look at the schedules for reinforcement, we look at the way creatures or people behave. If we look at a fixed ratio, so I know that every 100th press of a lever I'm going to get something, then what we see is the rat, the person, whatever, typically presses it as quickly as they can in order to acquire as many rewards as they can. If it's a variable ratio, then they will also press it, rather quickly, but the reinforcers are more spaced out. There's a slight difference in the rapidity, how rapid they do it, but it does accelerate quite quickly, the number of responses that you get. If it's based on a fixed interval, every 5 minutes, then we notice some neat changes. They don't press the lever or pull the button or whatever it is for the reward as often. They tend to go on and then they accelerate just before the time when the reward is given, almost to ensure the reward, and then it slows down and speeds up and slows down and speeds up. But the overall amount of time to get the behavior lengthens. If it's a variable interval, so it's based on time and the person or creature knows it's just based on time, but it's not fixed, then it's very slow and steady responding. It's actually the longest of the amount of time before they, as they are responding, they do the behavior the most distant, and it requires the greatest period of time. But the responses are are just varied, and they're based upon time, not how many times they push the button. And they know that as long as they keep pushing the button, they will get rewarded in a variable interval. Punishment is an aversive event. So far we've been talking about rewards and how you reinforce behavior with rewards. Now, a punishment can also come in two flavors. Positive punishment is when you deliver an aversive stimulus. So if you spank someone, or you receive a parking ticket, or you get a detention, that would be a positive punishment. Positive not being that it's good, positive being that it's something that has been brought into the person's life that previously wasn't there. Negative punishment is when we withdraw something that you like. And so if we say, oh, you've been grounded, or put a child in timeout, or revoke a driver's privileges. So then what we've done is we haven't brought something new into the life. We've taken something into the life that is pleasurable away. If we look at punishment, there are some times when it can be justified, but typically it can lead to rather negative things. It can result in unwanted fears. It doesn't convey any information to the organism as to why they've had this punishment. It just simply is a punishment. In human terms, it can justify pain to others. It can cause unwanted behaviors to reappear in its absence. So let's say that you're punishing someone for doing something, and then when the punisher, whoever the person is there, is not present, then the person may continue on, because as long as the punisher's not there, I'm not going to get punished. It may also cause aggression towards the agent. So if that person who is being punished may in fact lash back. And what we may also see is we see the dropping of one behavior and the creation of a new behavior in its absence. So for instance, if when I was training the dog, if I decided that I was going to take a rolled up newspaper and punish the dog with the newspaper for peeing on the floor, then I may have discovered that the dog was in fact then going around the house tearing up newspapers, and so or papers or books or what have you. So now I have a new unwanted behavior that I didn't want in the first place. If we look at Skinner, he used to think that the inner thought processes were completely ignorable, and that there were very few underpinnings, biological underpinnings, and we know today that that's not entirely true. We also know that there's evidence of cognitive processes, and we know that the creature is thinking during this operant learning. And when you get, for instance, like a rat learning a maze, and there's a reward at the end of the maze, rats will develop kind of a cognitive map, or a mental representation, a layout of the environment, quite similar, I guess, in many ways to Thorndike's law of effect, where the cat memorizes how to get out of the puzzle box more quickly. And so while the reward is strong, we also know that there is a cognitive process going on underneath of it, driving them towards the reward. This is something called latent learning, and so those cognitive maps I was talking about, like a rat learning its way through the maze. Sometimes we know that the rat has learned its way through the maze, and in fact knows its way through the maze quite effectively. And so if we look at these three lines as an example here, these are times and mistakes made by rats trying to get through a maze. And so if we look at this lower line here, this light blue one, this is the line created when a rat is always reinforced for going through a maze. So it goes through the maze in shorter and shorter, not periods of time, but rather with fewer and fewer errors, the number of days that it conducts the maze. And so you can see that its errors drop over time, and every time it gets to the end, there is a sweet little reward. And then if we take another rat and we train it to go through the maze, it also gets better at it, but if this rat is never reinforced at the end, it tends to plateau. It doesn't ever get to the fewest number of errors. Now this rat, the reddish colored line here, this rat starts off having very similar to the other rats. And then all of a sudden on day 11, which is about here, we start to place a kibble at the end of the maze. Well, look what happens to the rat's number of mistakes. It drops even below the one that is already reinforced. This is what we call latent learning. So we know that the rat has learned how to do the maze, but quite frankly, and I run the risk of throwing emotions on the rat, doesn't particularly have a desire to go through the maze particularly quickly. But then all of a sudden, after learning and having this cognitive map is then presented with a reward, the amount of mistakes plummets. And so, the faster I do this, the better, the quicker I get to my reward. In fact, outperforms the rat who expects that the prize will always be there. Which brings us to motivation. We talked about this a little bit in class. There's two basic classes of motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the desire to perform a behavior for its own sake. I want to do it because I want to do it. I want to do it because I want to get better at it. I want to do it because. And you have some sort of an internal reward system set up. Extrinsic motivation to do a task is because I'm going to be rewarded or I won't be punished. And so if you're going to your work solely just because of that paycheck, that would be an extrinsic motivation. But if you really do enjoy your job and you say, no, I want to go because I enjoy my work or enjoy the people that I'm with, that's an intrinsic motivator. That's something that's going to sort of bring you to your job in a different way. We know that there's biological constraints, just like cognition we were talking earlier, and some animals learn associations more quickly than others due to that. If you look at, let's say, a little weasel going around looking for food in various holes, looking for prey, because of the nature of its behavior, if you are having it to search things out as part of its reward or punishment routine, conditioning, it's going to be very good at it. Whereas if you have, let's say, a creature that is not a predator, that is not a searcher, like let's say a cow, for example, then it won't condition as quickly to that instinctive behavior that we see, let's say, in a ferret or a weasel. Skinner would have argued that all of our behaviors are shaped by external influences, reward and punishment. We tend to repeat behaviors that we're rewarded for, and we tend to do behaviors less that we are punished for. And the idea is that Skinner said, therefore, the environment is sort of in charge, and we have no free will. We are just biological machines going through our day, avoiding punishment and attempting to get reward as we sort of bounce off the bumpers of the pinball machine, if you will, backwards and forwards. And cognitive processes really have very little to do with it. It was kind of a very heartless way to look at human functioning. And so the idea that people could be completely taught by machines through rewards, you would have a token economy set up that if you got this amount of material done and checked off, then you would receive a reward, and if you didn't, then you would remain, and remaining was more of your punishment. And so the idea was, and if we look at computers today, we do see very similar actions in it. The idea, though, of teaching machines did in fact wane. It was quite popular toward the latter part of the 70s, early part of the 80s, where a lot of this was going on, but it has tended to wane quite a bit. We also know that reinforcers affect productivity, like that latent learning. We know how to do our jobs, we know how to do them well, we just might not do them as well because there is no incentive. And so if we look, let's say, to someone, not only are you going to get paid a paycheck, but if we sell X amount or Y amount of product A or B, you're going to receive an additional reward. You're going to get stock options. So as we improve, your wealth improves. We know that improves productivity. It's a great reward at the end. So it's not just about being a fixed interval of payment. Every 2 weeks you get a paycheck. Now there's something else as well. We look at the way that we deal with children. We want to reinforce good behavior, and we want to ignore behaviors that are not good. And so, if you're reinforcing the positive and you're completely ignoring the others, or correcting them if they're dangerous, then yeah, we know that that is a direct application. You've probably seen that at good and bad examples of that at the superstore with people trying to deal with their children if they're behaving or not behaving well. And so if we try and compare the two, in classical conditioning, the response is involuntary and automatic. Operant conditioning, it is voluntary and it operates on the environment. The acquisition is pairing a conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus together, whereas operant conditioning, we're trying to associate a reinforcement or a punishment with a behavior. Extinction, if you take away the conditioned stimulus, the response declines. And in this case here, the response declines when the reinforcement stops. So if we know that regardless of how many times you push the lever, if the person's gone home and you're not going to get a reward, that behavior stops immediately. Excuse me. In classical conditioning, organisms develop an expectation that one is going to bring out the other. So when you sound the neutral tone, the dog is expecting to get food. In this case here, they're expecting to get rewarded or punished. And also we know that they will have latent learning even without reinforcement, that they're going to learn it regardless. Once this is acquired, it's not really a matter of knowing it or learning it. It's just going to happen. And this one here, it may or may not, depending upon that environment. And we know that there's natural predispositions with classical conditioning, and we also know that creatures learn best in their natural environment. So if we take, like I said earlier, a weasel and is doing a hunting behavior, then it's going to operate well in that hunting behavior. Whereas if it's not their natural response to their environment, they typically don't do as well. Okay, folks, that's going to end our operant conditioning unit. I'll post this up. I'll probably also put a link up there. There's a fantastic Hank video that kind of looks at the two of these two. It's quite comical. He does a good job of it as usual. Enjoy the rest of your break. I'll talk to you on Friday. Bye-bye.